free to submit any questions that you may have to our Q&A function. Um, but first, I'll ask Corey for his response. We've seen states increase their funding for arts programs across the country. How does this increase in funding impact access to programs? And how can schools utilize this funding to make their programs more inclusive?
That's a heavy question. And first of all, being from North Carolina, I was just in Raleigh last week to speak with some of our legislators and actually thank them for some of the increased funding that we have received, but also encourage them to look at increasing funding in all 100 counties. Like sometimes there is there is a definite gap in rural funding, but what I find is that where there is also a very definite gap in schools that consist of a majority minority or has a majority global majority population there within those schools. But the last part of your question, which is how do you utilize that? How do you put that to work? I think that there are multiple ways of educating and of working with students for putting some of those funds to work. First of all is, as I said before, centering some of the students' experience. And so encouraging writing of monologues or slam poetry or writing short plays or 24-hour play festival, some of those things that will help to amplify a student's voice and to help them feel more like they belong. That is one of the first ways, and it doesn't cost a lot. Working from some of their experiences like that. The second thing I would say is to do some journalistic theater. Have students go out and do the research, do the work, and find the stories that exist within their communities or the stories that move them, and use those as experience. And then take your curriculum and match a bit of your curriculum to what the students are interested in. If it is like LBGTQIA+, did I get it all, issues, then find some of those plays. You introduce Angels in America after they've expressed the interest, or using, I love to go back to Shakespeare, but going back to Shakespeare, find the themes in some of those Shakespearean plays, like an absentee father or et cetera, and then teach Hamlet. Those are the ways of attaching and using the leveraging of those funds that you get and then share it out into the community. That is another way of investing in your program and investing, like going to the middle schools, or if you're a middle school, going to the elementary schools to help to feed your pipeline into your program, as well as invest in the community of what people are. And then find non-traditional spaces to perform those things. Going to a senior center to perform your poetry or your original songs or your original monologues. When the audience doesn't come to you, you go to them, and then you share with them the next thing that you're doing to get them to come to your spaces.
Absolutely. I think so often we hear this idea of, teaching curriculum that matters to students, teaching that culturally relevant curriculum that matters to students within, STEM or reading or social studies or any of the other classes. But that just applies just as well to the arts as well. Teaching, relating those themes back to students in their personal lives helps them to be able to really get engaged. And I appreciate you kind of touching in on that.
And may I add one more thing with that? As you say that, I once again say offer up to offer students a future in this, and our compliments, the things that we say, the moments that we stop and say that was really good, you have the potential to be a great writer. It is amazing how those little things will embed in a young performer's mind, and they will hold on to some of those compliments for a very long time, and that can help to shape that trajectory and that ability to move into the arts. If a kid says, "Oh, I think I want to sing," and they're like, "Who do you think you are, Beyonce?" You're immediately shutting off their future and attacking where they see themselves and what their self-worth can be. So that investment is not a cash investment, but it is an investment that we can make that is just on a human scale.
Absolutely. And then I'll turn it back over to Alasia. The same question that we've seen an increase of funding for arts programs across the country. So how does this increase in funding impact access to programs? And how can schools utilize this funding to make their programs more inclusive?
Yeah, I agree with so much of what was just said. I think, I don't know the ins and outs because I'm a teaching artist, because I work in so many different realms. I'm not privy to like what the actual funding and the XYZs of that is. But I know like any increase in funding for the arts is always a good thing. That's always what can you do with what you got, right? Don't limit yourself to whatever that funding is. I think a big thing is, again, bringing arts into schools specifically, because that's another access thing. Not all students can go see theater. Not all students can go take classes at a large arts organization. With my specific programming, I always, seek out community partnerships with rec centers, libraries, things like that, to have a wider range and access for kids. But yeah, I think bringing it into the school though, and they don't have to go somewhere else to experience it, is really, really important. And not only that, partnering with organizations. There's so many organizations that I actually work for or with and partner with that will hire me out to go to schools, and they pay for it. Like they have the funds, and it's like, well, what do you need? What are you able to pay? Great, we'll make up the difference. We will pay the artist. So seeking those types of partnerships out as well. And then also I'd say not only those types of partnerships, but in what was said as far as like having kids create their own material. Like, you are going to be our next playwrights and the canon for the next generation. So encouraging them to just write and use their voice that they have and encourage that creativity, I think is really important as well. And again, that's like within the school. And it doesn't take much to do that. It doesn't, sometimes the excuse is like, oh, well, we can only do XYZ because then testing is happening and we have this, like, there's this rigid structure. And it's like, yeah, but how can you combine, maybe if it's a social studies thing or, whatever that is, how can you incorporate some art in there, or them writing something in their own voice about what you're doing already in curriculum? And I will say, like, on the spoken word front, like, I know I did a program where I did like a unit for language arts students. And I remember this theater, they were so well-meaning in that, they had an idea for what they wanted these kids to do. And it was something I had done similarly, an episodic project with some students. But they're like, well, we want them to memorize. We want them to write their own piece. We want them to memorize. We want them to perform it, film themselves, because it was also still in COVID times. And I was like, we got to meet the students where they're at though. So we've already accomplished, like, all right, we've come to them, but we can't then put this pressure on these language arts students who are not performers. They're not theater kids. This is the first time they're probably writing their own piece of poetry. They're not going to then also memorize it and film it. So like, it took me to be like, oh, let's pump the brakes and realize, like, let's meet the students where they're at. Best intentions from the theater again, but like, how can we tailor this into an experience that's not going to then maybe traumatize them even more, to be like, oh, I don't know if I can do the arts because it's so much and I'm overwhelmed. It was like, how do we truncate this a little bit and make it more tangible? And then they had a great time because, again, I had the wherewithal to be like, let's tailor this to what they need and meet them where they're at.
Absolutely.
I would also say really quick too, just with the funding, as far as if it's not in the schools, finding those places again to do theater for young audience field trips, specifically with theater. Like, what are those organizations that are having TYA specifically in your communities that you can go see theater, or there's orgs that will come bring plays to you. So many opportunities for how you can use funding.
Absolutely. And there was two components to that accessibility piece that you really touched on and really beautifully kind of narrated, is not only meeting the students within the schools, bringing the exposure to the arts within the school system itself, this kind of access to the resources, but also being able to individually meet them and not ask too much on their plates, because like you said, they are students, they have lots of other things going on in their lives, but helping them to kind of pull them along to encourage them to engage with a lot of this work.
Yeah,
That's absolutely awesome.
it would be building blocks. You know, you start with one foundation and you move up, and then you move up, and then you increase. And as the interest increases and as their abilities increase, then what you do is you place a few more expectations on them, and you start, it becomes a cycle of like every, you know, we're going to go old Black church, every round gets higher and higher. So yes.
And so my next follow-up question is for you, Corey.
Mhm.
Of course, the Theater Initiative Gap has been collaborating all across North Carolina with lots of different institutions. For example, like Central Piedmont Community College, to prepare high school graduates for their undergraduate education. So by working with institutions like this, what have you all learned about how other institutions, maybe outside of North Carolina, could better prepare students of color for pursuing a degree in the fine arts?
I'm glad you asked that. And I'm going to take a little moment to step back and explain a little bit about TGI and then how it is that we do this. So we are specifically a gap year program designed to help students of color make it through that gauntlet of auditioning for, applying to, interviewing with colleges to get into BFA acting and musical theater programs. Our partner is Central Piedmont Community College, where we do our training. So we do the sort of dual enrollment with our students who take a few classes through Central Piedmont, like voice and diction. They take a college readiness class as well as a public speaking class. But then TGI, I use our teaching artists. I have like 16 teaching artists that come in and work with the students to teach private voice, music theory, movement for the actor, acting for the camera, and you know, a whole litany of things, some improv, some, and then we also support the students through having like some mental health things, like a counselor that comes in and does some group work with the students. They do yoga, we do some strength training, all of these kinds of things. And so then that is the training part, and it is rigorous, it's 7 months, and we are pushing, pushing, pushing. The second part of that is preparing the students for their FAFSA, applying for scholarships, writing those essays, both their personal narratives as well as scholarship essays. We also finally take the students to auditions where they can be seen by multiple colleges. And one of them is called the CAP auditions, that'll be in St. Louis this year. It's 55 colleges that they audition for in one weekend. Or we go to New York City Unifieds, and there are like 40 some schools that are at Unifieds. So working with those students through that process, we interface a lot with college programs. The students, when I said that about demystifying the spaces, that's a tactic that I use. We Zoom with several programs, like some of them very small, like 5 towns that people have never heard of in Long Island, up to like the University of Michigan and Carnegie Mellon that like everybody has heard of. And let the kids listen to the pitches and also apply what they hear to what it is that they need. Not every school, not every kid needs to be like flipped into shape, if you will, through a whole process like a CCM. Some of them need to be nurtured and sort of carry through, like Valdosta State in Georgia. So those conversations with these schools, the second part is schools are always saying, we need more diversity. We want more diversity. And so then I start facilitating the question or asking the question, okay, now you have some, do you know what to do with this student in front of you? Do you understand some of the things that these students need and some of the support that they require, or some of the, we use this word a lot, some of the trauma that they've experienced through some of their public school experiences, and how do you reverse that, or how do you keep from doing things of the past? Where I literally had a college professor say to me, I used to actively discourage Black students from getting their degree in theater because it is such a rough and unsure career path to take. And my response is, that was not your decision to make.
Yeah, that's, I think, really powerful to see this kind of large scale network that an organization is able to have with a lot of these issues. How important these conversations are with the folks within those fields. And that's great to hear that despite hearing something like that, you're able to kind of talk with them and address them and hit home about these students are going to need these supports and this is what it looks like. I think that's awesome. And then Alasia, my next follow-up question for you is, throughout your experience running your own acting program, what teaching styles help keep students from historically marginalized backgrounds in the arts? And how do you personally encourage them to pursue performing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll kind of speak on it, not only for my own programming, which is called Lele's Acting Jam, by the way. But again, it's coaching classes, it's all kinds of things. But then also in all the spaces that I teach in as well, because there's so many, like, gosh, again, whether I'm doing residencies or one-off workshops or, teaching at the Black Arts Festival one week and then at a heritage camp the next, like I just do so much teaching that it's like all encompassing. But I would just say, first and foremost, just being authentically me, like I really come to every space I'm in just as an artist, as a human, as a person, open, engaging, empathetic. If I don't know an answer, I'm going to tell you that. And I think that's so important for kids to hear that like adults don't have it all figured out. If you decided you don't like this thing, guess what? I'm also not offended if all of a sudden, like I had a kid last week, I was doing some residencies and the kid was like, I just kind of want to be done with acting. And some teachers are like, but I came here and I taught you this curriculum. But I was like, that's okay. Life is about choice and life is about figuring out what you like or don't like. She was like in second grade, but it was like, even that's okay. That's okay for you to say. And I'm not going to be that educator that's like, well, is that very nice? Absolutely. You used your voice and you told me, hey, this wasn't really for me. And that's all good. So I just like always try to be real with the students. Obviously, I got to call it out. Being Black is already, for me, an advantage as an educator, because not only for kids of color, but also for white students, I'm usually the only Black teacher they've not ever had, but specifically in the arts, sometimes that they've ever had. I've had white students, I mentioned this in my essay too, but like, there's a lot that I have to navigate as a Black teacher, artist, with observational comments and those teachable moments for white students who don't have exposure to other cultures. And I think it's very empowering for students of color to watch me navigate those moments. So one example is, again, in Making History, playing Sleeping Beauty. I remember a white student being like, well, you don't look like the one from the movie. And it's like, great, this is a great moment to like talk to all the students about diversity and how princesses and people come in all different colors, shapes, sizes, abilities. And another example is like, I had a student once ask me why my hands were two different colors. And I like laughed because I had never had that question before. Again, something I had to navigate. And you know, I know it was a kid and it was harmless, but it was like, your proximity to Black people, like, let me explain this to you. But I also had other kids of color in the class who were like, yeah, my hands are like that. And it's like, we're having these real conversations that aren't just art, it's life and it's culture and it's all of that. So I just think it's really important. And even in building like social emotional skills as well, none of them are separate for me. It's all one. And then I would also just say, again, just embracing just different cultures from my students. I know another residency I just had, I was trying to brush up on my Spanish, and this student, she was still learning English. And I remember I was like, okay, there were some kids that were helping translate, but I was like, no, as an educator, I need to make sure she's getting it. And she was always smiling, having fun. But I'm like, no, I'm going to whip out my translator app, and that's okay. I want to make sure you know what we are doing. I'm not going to just assume you'll just get it. I'm going to take the time to make sure I'm using this app and you know exactly what is going on. So you are never feeling othered or feeling like you are not included in the space. So I just think those are just some examples of just, again, always making sure that I'm, like you said earlier, modeling and being that physical representation for students of what this looks like. I do want to add to the second part of that, and encouraging pursuing performing. I would also say I don't only encourage them to pursue performing. There's so much in the arts. So I always, and I have it with me now, anytime I'm teaching, I'll show students like my scripts, and I'll show them like costume renderings of shows that I'm in. And I'm like, hey, did you know someone had to draw? They had to actually sketch this out, their idea and their vision for what our costumes look like. And then they go buy the material, and then even trying to make a reference, and not assuming everyone celebrates Halloween, right? Because not everyone does, but being like, it's similar to Halloween when you have a costume. But instead, in acting, they actually tailor that to you, only you wear it. And so really like engaging them in that, and like adding on to that, we need lighting designers, we need set designers, we need people to write our scripts, we need people to operate our cameras, we need boom mic operators, we need directors. So just really painting a full picture of the art, so that if they are shy and maybe they don't want to be on stage, maybe they don't want to perform, it's like, oh, there's so many things that we need from you in the arts that aren't just you having to be on and be a performer. So
any moment can be a teachable moment. And I think with those examples that you talked about, you very clearly highlighted um, how you can take any kind of experience or question, and if you approach it with the right attitude, the right kind of passion for education, you can really kind of transform that moment into something more powerful, something that a student's going to be able to walk away and really remember. And then also encouraging those different avenues for this space, because like you mentioned, there's so many different ways that students can go into this field besides just being a performer. And that, I think that's really awesome. And so we're going to pivot over to our question and answers section from our audience members. So definitely encourage our audience to continue to submit those. But the first question that we'll look about is from Mary Jackson for Corey. I think we'll turn this one over for Corey, but she says, I appreciate the comments regarding the demystification of spaces. Can you all share any comments about solutions when dealing with arts educators who devalue cultural arts from minority and or marginalized communities?
You know, like, I wish that solution would be to replace them, but you know, that's not always going to be the case. There are people who are truly ingrained and in there. I wish that I could say that the answer would be like diversity training and sensitivity training, but as an inveterate teacher, I know how often I go to some of these staff developments in these training sessions and actually poo-poo everything that's being said. I say that well aware as I sit here in a webinar, being one of these people. But I think that particularly being willing to have conversations, if you are a person of color, and for you to sit down and over coffee or over tea or over drinks or over whatever, and like take the time to get to know some of these other teachers and actually share your experience and let them know honestly what it is that you go through and what it is that you see, and share some of the things that you have found kids have wanted, and ask them, how do you get out of your own head, and what are the things that excite you, and how can you, how do I put this, how can you tailor your passions to some of their passions too. I was once told, and it's one of my favorite expressions, the best learning comes from a student who asked a question that you weren't expecting in your lesson, because then you're all exploring this topic together. You're all learning together. And as lifelong educators and as lifelong learners, what I hope we do is encourage each other to continue to learn together.
Absolutely. It's really being intentional with going and approaching that person and trying to find that common ground to kind of address. I think that's absolutely a great point. My next question is coming for Alasia. I think this would be a really good one for you to respond to, about if there's any kind of specific training that an educator can take or undergo to utilize art with any interaction with children. And this training can include parents or social workers as well. If you have any recommendations there.
Can you repeat, like, what's the first part of that question? Just so I'm
Yes.
clear.
Is there any training that educators can take to utilize art within their interaction with children?
Yeah, I think it depends on like what kind of educational space you're in. But for instance, like one of the organizations I work with is called Wolf Trap. It's a national organization, Wolf Trap for early learning through the arts. And it's typically like a professional development type of thing where it's a residencies where a teaching artist like myself will come in, take curriculum content that you are wanting to explore in your classroom and then infuse it with arts integration. It's typically with ECE classrooms for that particular program. But yeah, coming in, giving the teachers the tools to, hey, think about the curriculum different, even if that's the jump off is this storybook that you're reading. And like, we're just going deeper versus wider with the content. So we can spend 2 days, or not 2 days, like maybe even 2 weeks on 2 pages of the book. And like, we just got so much out of it because we were really going deep on what maybe we're seeing on this page, from setting to, is there a social emotional component to what's happening in the literature of it? For example, so like that's one way. So seeking out organizations that might be in your states that specifically do professional development in that way. Again, I know I mentioned if we're talking like even on the trauma sensitive practices for educators that I would do, that was actually through Kaiser. That's through Kaiser Permanente, and it's called Rise Up: Resiliency in School Environments. So I think there's a lot of, just depending where you're at, just finding those organizations that can come in and help facilitate some trainings based on what you're trying to get out of it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I'll go ahead and drop a link to their website, that Kaiser Permanent that you had mentioned, Alasia.
Yeah, and you can throw in Wolf Trap as well. I don't know if the person's an ECE teacher necessarily, but I'm sure there's programs all over that will, depending on what grade levels you teach, definitely. And then I want to just piggyback on just like the continued of our own learning as well. I just think that's so important because we're in such a time that we have so much access to information that like there's no excuse. And this isn't to the person that asked it, but it's just something that resonates with me that like so often people are like, well, I just don't know where to start. And it's like riding a bike. It's like, well, once you jump on, you start to learn and you got it. But like, you got to be willing to like do the work. So we're just in such a great time that like we can always research whatever we want to learn. There's so much I didn't learn in school that I learned through my own education and self-education. So yeah.
Absolutely. There's a lot of power that comes with the internet and going out and pursuing a lot of that education for yourself. I absolutely agree with that.
Yes, YouTube University is real.
Yeah, it is. And it gives you more power in what you're bringing. It doesn't have to be, oh, I'm having to do these strict stipulations, or I'm trying to fit into some mold of some school. Is that decentering again and that demystifying of like, no, I'm going to bring in what I'm actually interested in that I've learned on my own and incorporate that with my classrooms.
And then our next question from our audience members is that, first off, they really appreciated this webinar, but they work with a lot of adult students who are a little bit older and may have missed the age for a gap year, like with the theater initiative, gap initiative. So their question is, how can more adult education programs be involved in supporting the arts slash supporting adult education opportunities? And Corey, if you might have a response to this to start us off.
I'll take a stab at it. There are a lot of acting studios, those kinds of things. And one of the things that are around the state. And so sometimes getting involved with a local community theater company or something like that, and getting into the network of learning where those things exist, because sometimes they're sitting right in front of you, like sitting in plain sight. Another thing that happens through almost all of the community theaters is that you don't have to be exactly an enrolled college age student to take classes, and some of them aren't even like for credit. They offer what they call, I think it's called like continuing education, things like that, that are like sometimes they're special interest classes in that way. So as an arts enthusiast, you can get 3 or 4 of your friends together and go to the community college and say, we would like a class in this. Can you find us a professor to teach it? And the community colleges will actually comply to that. They are there to try to be of service to the interests of the people that live in their areas. And so if you're willing to be proactive with some of those things, you can make opportunities happen for you through those avenues.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And so as we're coming to a little bit of a close on our webinar, one last question I'll pose to both of our panelists really quickly is, how can our audience members take the information that's been given to them today to continue to advocate for students of color within the arts in their own communities? And then Alasia, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think I would kind of go back to what I was saying earlier in that just continue to seek knowledge. That was a theme that we've been discussing, and and just the way we're showing up in spaces, just make sure you're actively doing the work, actively seeking out diverse material. If you're like, I don't want to do Shakespeare, let's look at some August Wilson. Let's look at, there's so many other opportunities and so much other work, and there's no excuse of not being able to find it. Just a simple Google search. I would also say, within that, knowing that it's okay to stub your toe and mess up or not have all the answers, because we never have all the answers. And I personally find, especially in doing inclusion, diversity, equity, access work, I've been the most harmed as a performer, as a director, as all the things, full-on artist, educator, by people who think they had it all figured out. Who thought, well, I read the book on white fragility, so I know your experience. And I'm like, but I've been living this my whole life. It's not about, you couldn't possibly know, but you just read a book. I appreciate that you're trying, but don't think that you've got it solved. And in order to be a true advocate and a true ally, you have to be willing to know that this is a lifelong journey, and none of us will have ever arrived. So I think as long as you continue to have that mindset, it's just really important, and especially when it comes to young people, because they're looking to us to help lead them and to help guide them. And so again, know that it's okay if a kiddo challenges you and you're like, that kind of challenged my thinking. Take a step back and work that out and not be defensive, or again, be okay with being uncomfortable. I guess I'll say that was long-winded, but yeah, there's a lot in there.
No, absolutely. Really coming to the work very humble.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you definitely captured that really well. Corey?
I think one of the most crippling or paralyzing words in the English language is perfection. And for us to feel like we can't do anything unless we've perfected it first is the very thing that will keep us from doing the work. As Alasia said, the first thing to do is actually get to work. Okay. I keep thinking about how it was that I started with TGI, which is asking a very genuine question about how it is that I can help. And then you set your mind free on some of those things. And after you've come up with an idea, you don't just sit on it and wait for it to gestate and wait for it to become perfection. You actually put it to work. What we've been discussing are the things that we've experienced and the things that we've been doing. Each person's journey is individual to themselves and individual to their skill set. If you are an art teacher, you can do many of the same things through art, from an artist's realm of like painting publicly, or demystifying what an art studio looks like, or making, if it's pottery and they're making ashtrays, even though children shouldn't smoke, but, like starting it small and then building into that and welcoming students to come in and do a little bit more. If you are a singer, or if you're a music teacher, or whatever those things are, is just opening up your arms and embracing more people to come in and try. And then when you see that one that's like, holy cow, they've got something, encourage them to have a future in it and to keep going on that journey.
Absolutely. I think you both really captured that theme of meeting students where they're at and continuing to be a resource and encourage them in this work. Because it's great to be able to have students that are able to come, be vulnerable, and yet met where they're at, recognized for who they are and their backgrounds. So definitely appreciate you both for responding to that question. And that'll actually bring our webinar to a close. I'd like to thank both of our panelists for being here today. You've both shared lots of very insightful comments and advice for going about this work. And it's very clear to see, that expansive list of experiences have really helped shape how you are able to encourage students and uplift them through the work that you do. So I deeply, deeply thank you for coming and speaking with our audience today. Just to wrap up, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been great.
And just to wrap up our conversation with a few housekeeping notes, I'd continue to encourage our audience members to attend some of our other webinars that we have focused. A lot of our webinars are focused in different content areas across the educational spectrum. With our next webinar through our early childhood team, looking at supporting early childhood mental health for students, along with a couple other topics that we have lined up for the month of May. So feel free to check out our website to see where those are. And this webinar will be posted to our YouTube page after the event. So feel free to come back and rewatch it and continue to get some of those insights. But again, thank you both for being here with us today. It was very great to kind of hear this conversation about how to best support students of color within the arts. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you, everyone.